the influences of the media.
Teenage savages go wild in a juvenile jungle of lust and lawlessness.
A flood tide of filth threatening to pervert an entire generation of our American children.
I'm Dr. Ben Litherland.
And I'm Dr. Richard McCulloch.
We research media audiences.
And this is Ill Effects, the good podcast about bad media influences. I don't know about you, Ben, but something just feels a little bit different today.
I'm ready to do some yoga.
What is it what's different?
I'm so relaxed.
You're so relaxed.
I'm so ready to study. Give me some journal articles and some highlighters. Oh.
Today, listeners, we are looking at the question of background music. This is something, actually, Ben, you got me into this, like playlists like this.
That's so embarrassing.
Is it?
I did, yeah. I don't know. Maybe it's really cool. Maybe all the cool kids are.
We're listening to one of about 50 bazillion YouTube playlists, which are titled things like Beats to Study To, Lo-Fi, Chill Out, help you concentrate, things like that.
Yeah.
The reason why we're starting this is because I think it's a fascinating topic. I think a lot of people use playlists like this to study, to work to do all sorts of activities and exercises and things too. But what we're interested in today is what is the connection between background music of different kinds and certain kinds of behavior, like getting better at something.
Yeah.
So the actual question I want to explore today is, does background music make you more focused?
Okay, interesting.
Now, we'll take that question of focus in different I've chosen that word quite deliberately to open it up to different kinds of focus. But yeah, I mean, you use playlists like that as well, right?
Yeah. I probably did get you into this certainly for kind of 5, 6, 7, 8 years now. I struggle to work in silence.
Okay.
Whether it improves my work or my output is a very different question.
That's the question.
But I do personally, like, I enjoy it. I can't really work with music. Like, I've listened to music whilst I'm working since I was a teenager, but like lyrics, words, people speaking can be a little bit distracting sometimes. Yep. So I sort of shifted and moved into ambient music or sort of like backgroundy music.
Yeah.
And then just made a conscious decision of like every time you have to like put on a new album, that's like a decision that you have to make. So a YouTube channel that, you know, it just sits in the background. I don't have to think about it too much. It fills the empty gaps. I enjoy it, yeah.
Yeah, and as you say, like choosing something else would be a distraction from work or reading or whatever else you're trying to do.
And I'm very easily distracted from work.
But the fascination with this, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it today, is not just because me and you listen to them. They're really widespread. Right? So if any of you use Spotify or a similar kind of, you know, platform to listen to music, you go onto that, and Spotify in particular, I went on mine last night to have a look at what kind of playlists is it making for me. And there's whole sections themed around mood, around how particular kind of playlists make you feel, and some of those things have implied kind of behaviors and effects in there as well.
Interesting,
in a kind of in a way which is a little bit different to other effects that we've looked at, I think.
Yeah,
so that's why I wanted to do it.
The stakes are a little bit lower.
Yeah. And in some cases positive, rather than like, you know, warping our brains and things like that.
So this playlist isn't going to make me go out and kill people.
Well, we'll see where we get to by the end of the episode. Tune in. Stay tuned, everyone. But yeah, I did find it funny. Spotify makes playlists for me like the saddest playlists in the world, and you know, So it's got like
What's on that? Just Coldplay.
sad songs, sad bops, life sucks, rainy day, lo-fi, and IDK, which I believe the whippersnappers. That's an abbreviation for I don't know.
Are you all right, Rich? Do you want to talk about it? What does Spotify think's going on in your life?
Well, I'm a middle-aged man who started a podcast, Ben, so I think you can tell how well it's going. Anyway, but these playlists, they are very widespread. They are for all sorts of things. There's every kind of playlist for every conceivable mood, it seems. If you want to feel happy, you want to feel sad, you want to concentrate, you want to be in the mood for romance, you're going for a walk in the woods, you're getting ready for a night out, you're working out, right? Background music and the playlists, the curation of background music has become big business.
Yeah.
And it's become I'm not even as interested in the business side of it for the moment. It's just a big part of our lives.
Sure, yeah.
So that's what I want to talk about today. But one of the things that I think is different with Spotify and those kinds of like mood playlists to the kind of stuff I want to focus on today is that you still fundamentally choose to consume those things, right? You make a decision.
Yeah.
I want to be relaxed.
Yeah.
Or I want to be upbeat and get ready for my night out. Or I feel sad. I want to embrace that feeling. I want to feel more sad and listen to sad songs, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But you're making a choice to feel that way. Mm-hmm. But there's a whole subset of music with a really, really long and fascinating history, as we'll see today, which is based around music that's in the background that we haven't chosen, which may have effects on our behavior as well. So that's what I want to get into. And I want to talk particularly about something called Muzak. What do you know? And it's okay if the answer is very little.
Yeah.
But you've presumably heard the word. Do you know much about Muzak, what it is?
Do I know much about Muzak? Immediately, I'm thinking 80s jumpsuits.
Okay.
I'm thinking elevator music as a term. Mm-hmm. So my British brain would like to call it lift music.
Yep.
Elevator music as a thing.
Yep.
And as another middle-aged man with a podcast, if you release this on a 4-disc vinyl ultra deluxe £100 deal, I'd be right there. I've never listened to it, but like, I feel like I'm into it.
Yeah. I mean, I've been listening to it in preparation for this podcast, and let me tell you, it really improved my focus.
That's why Spotify's giving you those recommendations.
But anyway, so Muzak is it's two things really. So it's in the lowercase version, it's a kind of music.
Okay.
In the uppercase version, it's a brand. The company.
It's a brand.
It's a company who is responsible for that music.
Oh shit! Okay.
But it's one of those brands that has become so synonymous with the thing it makes that the brand name becomes the thing that everyone uses to refer to it, even when it's not made by them.
Yeah.
Like Google or Hoover's or. If you're in America, like Xeroxing something, like instead of photocopying something, stuff like that. But yeah, it's a brand name for recorded music. This is the Cambridge Dictionary definition. A brand name for recorded music that is played quietly and continuously in public places such as airports, hotels, and shops to make people feel relaxed. So crucially, they've got that little bit on the end. There's an implied effect there.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm really interested in today. What I'm going to get you to do now is to just have a look through a selection of print ads for Muzak, this service, this kind of music.
I'm excited.
These are all from around the 1950s, 1960s.
Okay.
So just take a couple of minutes to look through them and then...
Right. Yeah. I see what's going on here. Okay. So I've just looked at a series of advertisements that I assume are from a trade press. They're directed towards bosses.
Certainly they're aimed at employers. I'm not actually sure where I found most of these in an online archive of old advertising kind of thing. So I'm not exactly sure what publication they came from. But certainly, yeah, they are definitely aimed at employers rather than consumers.
Yeah. So choice headlines. Imagine music cutting bookkeeping errors by 49%. 24 test workers do 8% more. That's the gist. There's a lot of numbers, weird numbers that immediately my bullshit sensors are sort of through the roof. But the idea of Muzak supporting psychological factors that underpin work to improve outputs and productivity and similar things. I'm intrigued. It's perhaps not a headline, but one of the adverts suggests that there's music for the office and music for the factory floor.
Yes.
Which I really want to hear those two genres, the two genres of music. Factory floors and offices.
Yeah, there's actually more than two, but yeah, those are the two main ones that were aimed at employers. But absolutely, yeah. So these are aimed at employers. All sorts of facts and figures about how much money you could save your business by reducing wasted time, improving workers' morale, things like imagine music cutting bookkeeping errors by 49%. Like
49% is so high a claim.
Yeah, I don't really know where they've got that from. Output per operator increased about 10%. My favourite one actually is the last one. I don't know if you got a chance to. The writing's quite small on it, but it says, "Give them Muzak for Christmas." And the claim is, Muzak is the one perfect gift you can give your employees. Functional music by Muzak will contribute to their well-being, productivity and efficiency all year round. It's a gift you'll take pride and pleasure in too. No time is as ideal as Christmas to introduce Muzak. Only in the vast exclusive Muzak work music library, that's a really cumbersome sentence, are all the traditional music and holiday carols especially arranged to capture the holiday spirit in appropriate fashion for offices and industry. So I just love the idea that a boss is kind of mulling over, what could I do for my employees this Christmas? Should I give them a
bonus?
Bonus, pay rise,
party,
time off? No. Music to make them work harder. And they'll like it, and they'll thank me for it.
So I worked in a shop once that had a playlist that only had 6 songs on, and they were the worst shifts of my life. So I love the idea of my boss being like, here's an extra song. Like, no, just replace the playlist. Just let me work in silence.
To be fair, one of the things, I will talk about this in more detail later, but actually one of the things about Muzak that is a kind of, I guess, a selling point is that it's not repetitive.
Okay.
It is a very varied library in ways which is actually quite carefully thought through.
Because I don't have to listen to those 4 Japanese pop songs on repeat. Okay.
Yeah, and in some cases, Muzak was a kind of so that to avoid circumstances like that,
right,
where people were getting really fed up with listening to the same song over and over again. But as you can probably tell, the reason why I wanted to start with this is because of the claimed effects, and there's loads of them. I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to give you a selection.
There's so
of
many
ads.
Claims here.
So it reduces.
There's so many numbers.
It reduces absenteeism. It improves your morale. It improves your attitude towards the workplace. It prevents fatigue. You perform better in tests. You don't make as many errors. Like, this is a lot of claims.
This is a miracle music.
Exactly. So someone needs to do a podcast on this, right? But there's all sorts of claimed effects wrapped up in this, and the entire history of this kind of music. And when I say Muzak, I am thinking about background music in broader terms, not just from that company there. Yeah. But there's all sorts of claimed effects that have been attributed to different kinds of background music for many, many years. Going way back to even pre-recorded music, people like Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War talking about the soothing effects of music and things like this. Many people in the advent of the Industrial Revolution made claims about music being a potential antidote to that, something that can help to soothe us in a very rapidly changing kind of industrial times.
Sure, right, yeah.
One of the things I learned, which I didn't realize, you mentioned the term elevator music before, which I, like you, thought of as music which is in an elevator.
Yeah.
It's actually not meant in that sense, or not purely in that sense. It's elevating your mood.
What?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am going to choose not to believe that. That's my world cannot be.
Well, it's a double. So it's partly about being in elevators as well. But again, that was partly about elevators and lifts being a new innovation that some people were scared of.
Right, so it's anxiety.
You put the music in there and people feel a little bit calmer about going up, 20 stories in this rickety little box. It's one of the reasons why elevators had attendants for many, many years after they clearly didn't need them, is just to make people feel more safe and secure in them.
No, that's interesting. Was the elevator attendant really good at his job? Just doing like 8% more pressing of that button because of the music.
He pressed it so fast. always held the door open when there was someone running for it. He always spotted
That's
them.
why no one could fire him. He was just working so goddamn hard.
So lots of effects then, as you can see. Another one was about making public spaces feel more coherent, particularly big public spaces like the Empire State Building, which when it was opened in the 1930s, it had piped music,
Right,
that kind of
okay.
thing, installed so that people could walk around all this huge building, go on all the different floors and feel like there was a kind of a coherence.
They're still in
between
the same
floors. They're still in
space.
the same space,
Yeah.
exactly. And one great little tidbit that I found about the Empire State Building and kind of this what's so-called piped music. On July the 28th, 1945, there was a plane, a small bomber plane that was running a cross-country mission that crashed into the Empire State Building's 79th story.
Yeah.
All the people in the plane were killed, and some of the people in the building were killed as well. 14 people altogether. Very tragic accident. Flames shooting up the elevator shafts, damaged cables. People were stuck inside an observatory on the 88th floor. It sounds pretty scary.
Sounds horrific.
Right. But the front page article the next day in the New York Times reported, even at this terrifying juncture, however, the canned music that is wired into the observatory continued to play, and the soothing sounds of a waltz helped the spectators there to control themselves. There was no panic, but within a few minutes, the heat and choking fumes from the fire below made the observatory uncomfortable. I mean, I think we can probably take that story with a bit of a pinch of salt.
What a weird thing. Like, oh my God. I'm fighting every bone in my body not to be doing 9/11 jokes here. And like, I think I'm going to survive it. But like, the idea that music is going to calm people in that level of disaster is beautiful. I love it.
Yeah. I just love the image of, you know, like this horrific scene unfolding, fire everywhere, but like
Literally the "this is fine" meme, but like that's all we need is a waltz.
But yeah, I think Claudia Gordman sums this up very well in her book Unheard Melodies from 1987. She said, easy listening music, which was kind of an offshoot of some of this kind of music.
You don't hear much about easy listening anymore, do you? It's shifted.
Yeah, but it's a genre that's very much related to this kind of... Again, we'll talk more about the specifics of the music shortly, but easy listening music helps the consumer to buy, the patient to relax, the worker to work. Its goal is to render the individual an untroublesome social subject. So getting a bit political there as well, which I think we'll probably come back to that towards the end of the show.
If I'm in the Empire State Building that's burning around me, I just want to be a troublesome citizen. That's all I want from the world.
The point I'm trying to make, Ben, is that there is a pretty endless list of applications and potential effects and influences that this kind of music has, including some of my favourite examples, influencing the speed with which patrons of brothels go in and out.
Okay.
Poor choice of words. Which they make their exit and things like that. Apparently, some brothels complained about the music that was being played because it
was too fast or too slow.
Too slow. People were hanging around too long, getting too relaxed, basically. I
can't imagine being in a brothel listening to what I think music sounds like. That's wild. Okay.
Yeah. And one of the other things is that apparently it improves, if you play it to cows, it improves the quality of their meat because they're less stressed.
Oh, no. Oh, I've been a vegetarian for a decade at this point. I don't... The thought of the happy cow just chilling out to music.
Now... One thing you might be familiar with is that Muzak, despite all these potential, I mean, you said before, it sounds kind of like a miracle.
It's a miracle music.
Like, it's like, if it really can do all these things, like, oh my God, this is amazing. Right?
Yeah.
Yet, it has a pretty bad reputation.
Sure.
It's really widely disparaged. I would say that I've actually been won over by some of the research on this. I had a very negative image in my head of
Wow.
it. I've been won over purely because there's some really good writing on this topic by people who clearly are very passionate about music and elevator music and mood music and easy listening.
As a genre, as a...
Yeah, and a fascinating cultural history and things like that. And also, as I said before, I have listened to some of it and it worked quite well as a concentration aid, I thought.
I know it as much as a punchline than as anything else, I think.
Yeah. It's particularly in elevators as well. It's kind of like a bit of a thing in like there's a scene in the Blues Brothers, for example, where there's all the like army pouring in, and it's like cross cut between that and them in an elevator that's playing like the girl from Ipanema, like.
Yeah. Like it's quite a hackneyed. I've seen it done.
It's done in loads of
action
films. Yeah, it's kind of a punchline. But there's some people who really hate it, including some academics who I have found some of the most scathing criticisms of anything I've ever seen in academic literature.
Really?
So one publication in a very good journal, Consumption Markets and Culture. This is an article by Bradshaw and Holbrook from 2008. They say that Muzak represents a negative aspect of consumer culture in 4 primary ways. I'm going to paraphrase for sake of time, but they say it's intentionally dumbed down, provides a misbegotten case of aesthetics gone spectacularly awry. The relentlessly bad stuff is being force-fed to us almost as insidiously as trans fatty acids at a second-class fast food restaurant.
Jesus Christ, okay.
As its untoward purpose, this force-feeding seeks to manipulate us by changing our shopping habits. We'll get onto shopping later.
Okay.
And the result of this manipulation is commercial gain for greedy capitalist pigs. And they compare it to foie gras production. And then, a couple of kickers, any one of these atrocities would qualify as an indictment of music as a capital crime against humanity. But all 4 combined range far beyond the pale of human decency. Or beyond the pale if we take the goose liver analogy seriously.
Which we should take the goose liver analogy seriously.
They then, I think they came up with a nice bit of alliteration. They just think we had to put this in. They describe it as, this is Muzak, the brand, the company, as an infamous supplier of incalculably insipid instrumental inanities.
Say that after 3 beers.
Yeah, I can barely say it after no beers. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that it is widely disparaged. It's often seen as inauthentic. It's dehumanizing, dystopian in some cases. It's homogenized. It's low culture, mass culture, all of that kind of stuff. One of the things that I've picked up from some of the very passionate and well-researched literature on this topic is that I do think we should take it seriously. For lots of reasons, really. I do think some of the criticism is a little bit unfair because it's kind of thought of as being an anti-human thing, like this kind of mechanical, like almost like a MIDI version of like real music. Sort of things. But actually, it was performed by real and very talented human performers, sometimes huge orchestras. They didn't start using synthesizers until like decades after they became very popular. It became ubiquitous. It was a mass medium. And yes, you can criticize that in some cases, but I would say anything that is used and listened to by, millions and millions of people, I think deserves critical attention.
Yeah. There's creativity in its production and reception as much as anything else.
There is, but I mean, even beyond that, even if you do hate the music itself, you've got to acknowledge its cultural importance, right?
Sure.
Particularly in America, in the US. By the 1950s, it was the biggest consumer of phone lines in the world because the music came through the phone lines.
Oh, okay.
And actually originally through the light sockets somehow as well.
Wow.
Yeah, bizarre. I don't know how that works. I'm not an electrician. But yeah, so some people have described it very, very poetically as the amniotic fluid of modern life.
Oh.
But yeah, it's also spawned a lot of interrelated genres, including things like ambient music and, the works of revered artists like Brian Eno, for example, in the 1970s. But what I want to...
So Muzak comes first, because I was going to say, I do like Brian Eno and listen to sort of the more high status sort of like ambient people. But yeah, that's...
Way before.
I would have, in my timeline before this episode, I would have put this after Eno's work. So that's really interesting that Eno's sort of taking influence from this.
Yeah. Let's move on to a few quick definitions. I'm not going to give dictionary definitions here, but I just want to get a sense of what kind of music are we actually talking about? How do you feel now, Ben?
I can't tell if I love or hate this. I feel this feels like the introduction to a sitcom that I might have watched. It's quite relaxing, though.
It is pretty relaxing.
I don't hate it. I don't think. I'm still working out my feelings towards it. But it's enjoyable enough.
Yeah. It does fade into the background. I think one of the words that I often think of in relation to this kind of music is it's unobtrusive. So
Sure.
even if, whether you love it or hate it or don't really care or you're a bit ambiguous like yourself, Ben, it's unobtrusive, right?
It's not offensive.
No. The harmonies and the pitches, it's kind of sort of repetitive.
Yeah.
And it's quite relatively slow. At least this particular track we're listening to now is relatively slow.
Yeah. As we've been talking, it drifts into
Yeah.
the background very, very comfortably.
Drift is a nice way of describing it, I think. But yeah, you get like quite hypnotic sort of, harps and violins and string sounds.
Yeah.
Sometimes quite elaborate arrangements and things like that and harmonies, but generally they are not supposed to grab your attention, shout in your face and go, here I am, I'm a song, you need to listen to me. They don't demand your attention in that way. And that actually is really key to understanding what makes Muzak distinctive and some of the background music and easy listening as well, and why it might be able to claim to have some certain effects. One really good description that I like actually comes from UV Muschio, not sure how you pronounce that, but he was the president of Muzak in the early 1970s. At one point he was responding to the criticism of his company and the sound, all these things I mentioned before. Lots of people hate Muzak with a passion or hated it because it was everywhere. You couldn't really escape it in many cases. He says, and remember this is the president of the company, it's pleasant noise, if you will. Look, we're not in the business in the way a commercial record company is. Entertainment music is designed to be listened to. It draws attention to itself for its own artistic merit. That's not what Muzak is about. The point is to make the worker feel better, because if he feels better, chances are he will work better. It's as simple as that. So we get this distinction between hearing something and listening to it, which I think is kind of interesting. Another person from the Muzak company, this is a representative who worked in Hartford, Connecticut, described the basic reasoning behind Muzak. He says, if you try to listen to our music for entertainment purposes, I can guarantee that you will not enjoy it. When you play entertainment music, you either like it or you don't. If you don't like it, then it's irritating and you probably leave the store. If you do like it and it's your song, then you might stand there and listen to it. You might forget why you came in the store in the first place. So, both in the commercial and in the office and industrial environments, the point is that the music shouldn't distract you from your activities. It should be subconscious, for want of a better word. It fades into the environment that you're in. Now, that idea of Muzak being something that's very much in the background, I think is very much indebted to a much earlier music movement and a particular composer called Erik Satie, a French composer. You're nodding like you've heard of Satie before.
I know two classical musicians,
okay,
and he's one of them.
Okay,
I own a record by him, and
Okay.
for that exact reason of going back in time to listen to ambient music from the olden times.
Right. Well, one of the reasons I think Satie is really interesting is because he developed a few compositions that he called furniture music. And as the name implies, it is music which is not designed to be listened to. It's music that forms part of your environment.
And you can sit on it.
And you can sit on it and have an amazing little, just to sit, watch the telly. Yeah. So I'm going to get you to listen to one example. It's very short, it's quite repetitive, but you'll kind of get the idea. This piece is from 1917. It's called Carrelage Phonique.
Okay.
What do you think, Ben?
I'm into it. I want like a beat to drop. Does a beat drop?
Do you not know how to beatbox?
much. No,
Oh,
no,
God.
no, I don't.
God, I'm sorry I asked. Okay.
Is that it? That's
That
the
is
piece.
literally it.
Okay.
It just repeats that motif over and over again.
Yeah.
But the point is that it's a little bit like a wallpaper pattern.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And the point is that after a while, even though it is, I think it's pretty. I agree. I think if you put a beat behind it, it would sound pretty good, and you could.
I wonder
do
if
loads of
anyone's
things.
done that. I'm going to find that.
I'm
when
sure they
we've
have.
done.
I'm absolutely sure they have.
We'll put it in the podcast notes.
But absolutely, he was interested in this idea of music fading into the background, forming part of our environment, being very much like air conditioning or the colour on the wall, right? And one great little anecdote that I found in my research, which I just loved, comes from the first, and as far as I'm aware, only time that he actually played this music in public for an audience. What happened was, it was in 1920, and that music and a few other pieces similar to it were performed during the intermission of a play that was written by his friend.
Oh, okay.
And Satie's biographer claims what happened was, this is a direct quote, "The music, which consisted of fragments of popular refrains from Mignon and the Danse Macabre, and isolated phrases repeated over and over again, like the pattern of wallpaper, like the one we just listened to, was meant strictly to be nothing more than a background and was not intended to attract attention in any way. But the patrons, unaccustomed to regarding art with anything but genuflection, were deaf only to Satie's instructions and proceeded to strain their ears. An annoyed Satie leaped into the crowd and implored everyone to talk, make noise, or concentrate on the picture exhibition in the theatre hall. So he got really annoyed with everyone. He's like, "What are you doing?" Like, so he
Do a beatbox session.
He gave them instructions beforehand that they were to not listen to it. But as soon as the music started up in the intermission, all the listeners hurried back to their seats, and he's shouting at them, going, "Talk, walk around, don't listen." He's going. I mean, I can imagine that being really frustrating for like a very serious artist. But from my point of view, you know,
That is
100 years
funny.
later, that's very funny.
That is so funny.
But it's funny, but it's also quite instructive, and it kind of tells us something about that kind of that blurred line between talking about a particular kind of music as background music or something you pay attention to or you don't pay attention to.
Yeah.
There's a matter of agency there. As
I was
well.
going to say, you
depends
lose
on
control of it once
Yeah,
it's out.
Exactly. So that's something that I think is really interesting, and we will come back to that point when we look at the research on this, because I think that's something that gets mixed. There's often a sort of an assumption that because it's a certain kind of music that's been designed in a certain way and has certain kinds of sounds, that it can have certain kinds of effects.
Yeah.
But that ignores the fact that people can just ignore instructions, they can faff around, they can get up and talk. They might be listening to something else with headphones on these days.
Yeah.
You know, all sorts of complications can arise.
I didn't want to tell you this at the time, but when we were listening to the previous piece, I stopped listening to you. I'm not going to lie. I don't know what that says about me or you, but like I was struggling to keep up.
Well, yeah. You and my family both. Now, the invention of Muzak is quite an interesting story as well. It comes from this guy called, Brigadier General, to give him his full title, George Owen Squire. He was the man who invented...
That's not a real name.
It is his real name. It's his real name. And he might say the same about your name, Ben. Give him a break. He's did a lot of good in the world. Well, some people would say. But as you can tell, with a title like Brigadier General, he was in the military. So this is actually... despite its kind of, workplace applications and, all these ideas about influencing shopping behavior and stuff, its history comes from a guy who was in the army. Interestingly, one of the first members of the US Army to have a PhD. I couldn't find any earlier. There may be some. It's quite hard to kind of find out details like that. But he in the late 19th century, he got a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. And he was a really, by all accounts, a fascinating and really, really smart guy who invented all sorts of stuff. So he was in the military, but he was doing all this kind of like research for the military and fixing all sorts of things and inventing all sorts of things. He was someone who was really fascinated by telecoms, like telecommunications technology and radio technology and how to fix them. He fixed loads of underwater cables that nobody else knew how to fix. He was the first ever passenger in an aeroplane. He accompanied one of the Wright brothers on their first flight.
That's one amazing CV.
Yeah, he was the advisor to the U.S. Army when they bought their first aeroplane as well.
Okay.
He invented.
Presumably, the choice was quite limited. It's an easy job.
The cheapest one, mate. Fascinatingly, he also invented something he called a floraphone, where he turned a tree into a telephone antenna. How amazing is that?
It's amazing.
Like MacGyver stuff. Amazing. Absolutely shits on Bear Grylls. Like, he couldn't do that. Beyond all that, the thing that he became best known for was something called multiplexing, which basically means that...
Is that a sex thing?
No, Ben. Why would you even say that?
I don't know.
Why is your brain going?
I feel bad about... He just amuses me, but this... Yeah, go on.
Basically, multiplexing was not a sex thing, Ben. It was just to do with the fact that telephone cable lines could only transmit one conversation per pair of wires.
Right.
And he invented a way that it could transmit loads more. And this was a crucial bit of technology that would then be used to invent, this whole system of transmitting centrally controlled music to thousands and thousands of workplaces and hotels and restaurants and shops all across the US. Yeah. So a pretty impressive CV. The other interesting thing about George Owen Squire is the kinds of company he kept and the work that he kept doing even once he finished with the army. So he was always because he was a physicist and a researcher and an inventor rather than just someone who was in the army. He was also applying for grants from the government and getting loads of public funding to work on this kind of stuff. So actually, Muzak comes out of a really interesting sort of collaboration between the military, the federal government, and private enterprise. So and all in service of this kind of what would become known as like social engineering, right? Trying to influence people in particular ways, trying to influence, I guess today we'd call it nudge. Nudge theory, like nudging people in different ways and things like that. And
this is why that lad before was really, really angry, or the two authors were really, really angry. Yeah,
and fair enough.
Yeah, what would Adorno make of this?
Well, yeah, he was not a fan.
Really?
As you can probably tell, it ties in with all sorts of similar initiatives in the early 20th century. Have you heard of something called Taylorism before?
I have heard of Taylorism, yeah.
What do you know about Taylorism?
So Taylorism was the application of scientific methods to working conditions, so trying to improve waste in the production of things. So measuring how workers are working, measuring how long it takes them to do a particular task, seeing if you can rearrange the factory floor to do stuff like that.
Maximum efficiency, maximum productivity. Doesn't matter that we're turning the worker into a kind of an automaton and things like that. I think in many ways, a lot of the people involved in this probably didn't see what they were doing as a bad thing. I don't think they really thought of the kind of human impact so much, but
improving productivity.
Yeah, exactly. The history of Muzak then owes a great debt to telecoms, radio, federal funding, and also the development of all sorts of communications technologies, and the advent of scientific management and workplace initiatives to try and improve productivity and things. All of those things are important. You can't really just take one thing out and just see it as that.
Yeah.
What happens over the next few years? We're talking early 1920s when Squire first kind of develops this technology, and just before he dies in the mid-1930s, he changes its name from Wired Music, which was his first name for it, to Muzak. He was thinking of brand names like Kodak, and he wanted a sort of music version of that, like Kodak Muzak.
Yeah.
Kind of, it's catchier than Wired Music, I think.
I think so.
Works. What happens over the coming decades, so throughout the 1930s and 40s, is this technology starts to become widespread and the service that it provides starts to become widespread, but in different and kind of uneven ways at first. So actually, at first, it's billed. So I did a bunch of media research, like media history research, tried to find some of the earliest articles I could possibly find mentioning Muzak in whatever form. And the earliest I found was from 1935, so this is just a year after the brand was kind of named. And it's been talked about as a home technology, not a work technology, a home technology. So they're talking about the popularity of radio, which obviously was the big mass medium of the day, the wireless as they called it. But there was also, in this article, it's talking about an implied consensus about how annoying adverts are. Which sounds quite familiar today, right?
Yeah.
Bloody ads all the time.
Yeah.
And they just wanted to listen to their programs, right? But there's ads. Muzak was billed not as a replacement for radio, because they're like, we can't compete with that. That's massive.
Yeah.
But we could be radio without ads. That's what we could be.
So would if I was a home consumer, is it a subscription service?
It's like Netflix,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
The way that Netflix kind of came along as a streaming, Netflix as a streaming service. I mean, where it's kind of like an ad-free version of all sorts of other things that you might want to watch. So yeah, which I thought was really fascinating. It was expensive though. 1935, it was between $1.50 and $4.50 per month, which I haven't done the like inflation maths on that, but that's got to be like
that's a lot.
Yeah.
For
Tens
a consumer entertainment.
Yeah, definitely. But it did include music, but also not just music, interestingly. It was talking shows, news shows, broadcasts and things like that as well. It had different kinds of what they call classes, but basically like channels, we would think of them now. So it had Class A was like dance and popular music. Class B was light opera and semi-classic. Class C was like lectures, news, and occasional like church services and symphonies and things like that. But it was billed like a utility. It was kind of like your electricity bill, your Muzak bill, and things like that, which I thought was interesting. But again, I think that's partly because it's coming through the phone lines or the electricity lines. Yeah,
the early pay TV subscription services in the UK pitched it as like it's like your gas and electric.
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly, it's just a little aside in this article that I found. It also mentions that this kind of service was big in lots of other places around the world as well. 66% of people in Holland and Belgium subscribed to a wired entertainment service like this. 66%.
That's high.
In 1935.
Yeah, that's really high.
Which I couldn't believe. I thought that was pretty amazing. Unfortunately for Muzak, the home subscription package doesn't really take off in the way that they wanted it to. But they pivot to workplaces and public places, particularly hotels and restaurants seems to be a big one. I found loads and loads of adverts for places saying, come to our restaurant and we've got Muzak in the background sort of thing.
That's a selling point.
Yeah. And even like literally like New Year's Eve kind of parties, like the music is going to be provided by Muzak.
Yeah.
So, and that's interesting to me because it was kind of like, that suggests the Muzak was the central attraction for a while.
It's
kind of like a novelty. So it's not background music at all.
No.
Right? It's like the central appeal, which is...
Yeah, and the brand.
Yeah, which I guess is quite a common thing with lots of new technologies, right? With film, early film was mainly about, oh my God, those pictures are moving.
Yeah.
Not, what a great movie.
Yeah.
So there's a similar kind of thing there, which I thought was interesting. But where it really gets interesting for our purposes is around the late 1950s. And Muzak really, really leans into this idea that it is this scientific service. So all those ads that I showed you before, they were from the late 50s, early 60s. And it's because they entered into this period that they called stimulus progression.
Is that a sex thing?
It really does sound like it could be. I'll give you that one. Multiplexing I'm not having, but stimulus progression could be a sex thing. What would it involve, Ben? Talk me through your
My mum
stimulus progression kink.
No, it's all right.
But the point was that it's this was stimulus progression was the name that Muzak gave to its more scientific approach. It was also partly a kind of competitive edge kind of thing. So there was loads of other rival services offering similar things, and Muzak wanted to be not just another service, but the one that was specifically scientifically proven.
Right, yeah.
So all of its literature, all of its ads, that's why there's so many percentages and figures and benefits.
You see that. I was going to say, you really see that in those adverts.
Influences and things like that. But the thing that what I thought was really fascinating about this is that actually that's not just a branding exercise. They're not just going, hey, we're the scientific guys. There's actually something to back this up. There's something different about the product that they offer.
Okay, right? They're doing the science.
Yeah. And stimulus progression specifically refers to the way that Muzak's service its programming would be split into 15-minute blocks of time throughout the working day.
Yeah.
So you'd have 15 minutes of Muzak, followed by 15 minutes of silence. 15 minutes of Muzak, 15 minutes of silence. The silence was essential because otherwise the effects that they're claiming apparently stopped.
That nullified
the effects, because then it just became... Then it could become repetitive or boring or whatever. And the way that they tailored it was that within each 15-minute block of music, each song would get progressively more stimulating, hence stimulus progression, right?
Yeah.
So you can see in front of you, Ben, that there are a couple of graphs. The relatively straightforward graphs. Talk us through what it's showing, appears to be showing.
Yeah, so we've got two graphs, an early morning, a mid-morning. It marks 6 songs, so numbers. They start low, and they're measured against stimulus quotient. So they start slow and they get progressively more energetic.
Exactly.
Presumably.
Yeah.
And presumably my work is supposed to get more energetic.
Exactly.
Alongside them.
And yeah, so the line goes up basically. So within a 15-minute block, each song gets progressively more stimulating, which is designed, they say, to combat fatigue, boredom, which is a natural product of doing any kind of work.
Yeah.
You'll also notice there's 2 slight differences between the graphs.
Yeah.
So the early morning, which is billed as 8 o'clock to 8:15 a.m.
Starts really slow.
Starts really slow, much lower down, and only reaches a peak of 4 out of 7 in their stimulus quotient. Whereas the mid-morning one starts on a 3 and goes up to 7.
Yeah.
So they've actually tailored it in different ways to different points in the day.
Yeah.
And again, this is based on their research. The problem, as we'll see with their research, is not that it's necessarily wrong or I don't believe it. It's just it doesn't exist anywhere in terms of it's not been published in academic literature. It's not peer-reviewed. It's being produced by the company itself.
Yeah.
That, for me, is a red flag. That said, it does seem to be everywhere. And a lot of the academic literature that has followed up on some of their work seems to find some similar things.
Yeah. I instinctively don't like this sort of research, but I also know that a lot of my students over the years, a lot of my friends, like people put heavier music on when they really need to work and slower music on when they need to think about things. So whether you can pinpoint it to the degree this brand is claiming is a separate question, but the fact that people use music, energetic music makes people feel energetic, feels about right to me. Yeah,
absolutely. And they would measure, how stimulating a track was. So all the tracks in their library, they'd give a score to basically for things like, how many instruments were playing in the arrangement, what the tempo was like, things like that.
Sure.
And that would all contribute to the score. So there's an element of subjectivity, but it was a consistent way of comparing all the tracks. And then a computer would randomize those things to make sure I'm playing something that's a 1 out of 7, and then next I'm going to play a 2 out of 7 or whatever it is.
Got it, yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is that it combats fatigue, it combats boredom, and then also, according to their literature, has all these other influences and other behavioural effects as well. There were different providers, so not Muzak, but other providers like 3M, some people might have heard of, big company. They had their own version of this, which they didn't say was scientific. They just called it background music. And they said that this was more tailored towards retail and other commercial environments, which meant different kinds of music, not in 15-minute blocks, because people weren't there all day.
That would be weird,
You go to a grocery store and stay there for the entire day and then get bored of it. The employees might be bored of it. But for the sake of encouraging the consumers to, for example, spend more time there or spend more money there, they would hope.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that it's a continuous playlist rather than, in this stimulus progression kind of structure.
So this is really... Okay, got it, yeah.
And that brings us on neatly to talk about another point of focus, I guess, for this episode, that background music has been used by retailers and other kind of commercial managers and sort of spaces to encourage different kinds of consumption.
Yeah.
So we see ads like on the next slide, for example, the right beat can turn browsers into buyers, right? Again, we could maybe be dubious about these claims, but, there does seem to be something to it. Now, the idea of turning browsers into buyers is something that started to be studied a lot, researched a lot by various kinds of academics and other researchers from about the 1970s and 80s onwards, roughly. It's hard to put an exact date on it. But there's a a very influential article by Kotler, who talks about what he calls retail atmospherics. This is an article in 1974. He's really interested in, and it's really influential in marketing literature and consumer
I
culture
bet it
kind of
is.
things.
I bet.
It's all about, as you guess from the name, the conscious designing of space to create certain effects in buyers. For example, producing certain emotional effects, and obviously, in an ideal world, from the shop owner's point of view, purchase probability.
Sure.
Yeah, they want to get people to buy more stuff. So what I just want to talk about in this final section of the podcast really is about what some of this research looks like. And I'm not going to go into tons of minute detail because a lot of it is quite repetitive. I'm going to try and stay sort of like zoomed out and give a broad overview of this kind of stuff.
Okay.
But it's been very widely researched from the 1980s for reasons which are probably quite obvious, because managers want to know, does music have some kind of effect on the people who come in my shop? And if so, what is that effect, or what are those effects? How can I use those to my advantage?
Yeah.
How can I improve my business, whether that's to do with my employees or the people who are coming through the door and supposed to be buying stuff?
In a context where consumption has become, the primary site of leisure and all these other things as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And you will not be surprised to hear that a lot of the research on this looks very psychological. It's very...
my friend in yours, psychology.
Environmental psychology rather than, evolutionary psychology or something like that. But they talk about what they call stimulus organism responses models. And it's this... I hate it as well. But you have to hear it, Ben, because this is what's there in the literature.
Okay.
So it's the idea that the music is a stimulus that causes a particular reaction in the person who's come through the door, which may in turn lead to a behavioural response.
Sure.
Yeah. It's fairly easy to comprehend that bit anyway. They talk about measuring pleasure, arousal, and dominance models. So like... To what extent are people...
why are they so weird? Some of this is fine, but why... They're all so weird. Chill out, guys. Come on.
They really are. I think we can all agree that. But they're interested in, does it make people feel happier or less happy? Does it excite them or not? Does it make them want to stay there or go away? Do they want to carry on exploring the shop or not explore the shop?
Yeah.
It's those kinds of questions. And again, I think they're perfectly fine questions to ask. I don't particularly like the way they go about designing these studies, but... you can understand their reasons for doing it. My favourite one, which I found, which I do want to talk about in a bit more detail than the others, is by North, Hargreaves and McKendrick. This is from 1999, so not super old. But at least I don't consider 1999 to be very old. Probably some of our listeners might be like, whoa, Grandad.
We'll put Limp Bizkit on in the background.
Exactly. My ginger generation. This study was about sales of wine and whether music from a particular country had an effect on the kinds of wine that people chose to buy.
There's so many assumptions already based in this.
I don't think you can argue with these numbers, Ben.
Do you hate science?
When they played French music, they sold 40 bottles of French wine.
Right.
And only 8 bottles of German wine.
Okay.
When they played German music...
Kraftwerk.
They bought 12 bottles of French wine and 22 bottles of German wine.
I can't.
So...
indisputable evidence.
Exactly.
Well,
if you play French music, more people will buy French wine. And if you play German music, more people will buy German wine.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I don't understand, if this is all true, why there's so many boarded up shops in the UK at the moment. What? It's so obvious how you make people buy things. You just get some French music on, you have a selection of berets and French wine, and you're making money. Why? Why do shopkeepers not know this one simple trick to make people buy this?
It's worrying, isn't it, that this is... And I mean, one of the things that... I mean, you joked about Kraftwerk there. one of my pet peeves with this is that all the research in this, then there's loads and loads of studies, all sorts of different music, and sometimes they talk about different genres and like here, like different nationalities of music and stuff, but they don't talk about what the music actually is.
Yeah.
Like, is it Richard Wagner or is it Rammstein? I don't know, but I'm going to guess.
Du
hast Wein, now that you have bought it. That was a terrible German accent. I don't think I was attempting a German accent, but
I don't know. I don't know what you were attempting.
But anyway, it's they never clarify what the actual music is, which I think is
It's an important point.
It's really important.
It's
isn't it?
really, really important. And yeah, like also like how are the bottles labeled? Do people?
They had flags
Oh, they
at
had
the
flags,
side of the
okay,
display
okay,
to indicate.
okay.
So it was clearly kind of like, these are French wines, these are German wines.
Sure.
All the people that they spoke to said that they weren't aware of being influenced by music, as you'd expect them to say. But yeah, it's an odd study. It's been cited over 800 times.
I bet, yeah.
This is one that gets mentioned a lot in work on this. It's no better or worse than a lot of the other stuff that's out there, though. And what I will say for this literature is that there are lots of studies that do show some kind of effect.
I think I was going to come back to this. I don't want us on this podcast to come across as like, this couldn't possibly be true. Like,
yeah.
There's something logical there. Those numbers are interesting. I'm intrigued by it. I guess the question for me is always like, to what extent?
Yeah.
Like, what is the mechanism by which you think this is happening?
Exactly.
And these numbers are really small. I know it's really I'm bored too, listener, to be like, but these methodologies are a bit weird, or like, what are the methods, or like, how many people have actually been involved? But like, those numbers of bottles of wine in a single shop in a single location at a single point in time is provocative. It's
at best.
It's potentially interesting,
Yeah.
but I don't think it shows much, if anything. And the fact that I have to treat it like it has is when I get a little bit frustrated with this.
Has any of your work been cited 800 times?
No, it hasn't.
Exactly.
That's my fault.
But yeah. So we do have studies which show effects. There's various different variables that they study around, like, does it matter how loud the music is that we play, whether it's foreground music or background music? Is it slow? Is it fast? What genre is it? What setting are we using it in? Is this a restaurant or a supermarket or a chain store or wine merchants or whatever it is? And there are various studies that show things like playing slower tempo music will encourage people to slow down and spend more time in your shop, for example, which that seems pretty uncontroversial to me. It
seems possible, yeah.
There's stuff about playing classical music will encourage people in restaurants to buy more expensive wine. I'm a little bit more dubious about that, but I also don't have any particular reason to particularly say that's nonsense.
Feels a little bit Freakonomics, but
a little bit, yeah.
Potentially, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. And then we have things like, French music and French wine, German music, German wine. There's all sorts of things they study about, like how willing people are to buy. I always hate that as a kind of like purchase intention and stuff. Like, doesn't necessarily mean they will actually go on and buy anything at all.
Yeah.
They're just telling you in a survey that they are now more likely to buy it.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily...
Let's find out if that's true in 2 weeks' time.
Exactly. But they can measure more concrete things like how much money did each customer spend?
Yeah.
And are there any differences there? And sometimes they do find differences. The flip side, though, as you'd expect with, any field with lots of empirical studies on something as complex as this, is that for every study that does show effects, there's another study which either shows no effect or an opposite effect.
This is noisy data, ironically enough.
I like that. Very good. Should we just end it there?
I'm done for the day.
Right. So yeah, there's studies that say, we experimented with background versus foreground, and it didn't affect how much time anyone spent in our shop or how much money they spent or any of that. There's also loads of studies which just, I'm not really sure whether they're showing an effect or not, but they just sound terrible in terms of their methods and things like this. So there's one in which, I won't name the paper just for sake of, dragging someone through the muck, but like 593 business students watching a travel service exchange on video with background music in the video for some of them and no music for others. And then they had to say how they felt towards the salesperson in the video. Like, what was that?
That's confused and upsetting.
593 students got put through that. I hope they got class credit at least. All of this is kind of bringing us towards, I guess, our conclusions for this episode, which is to say that we started with this question of, does background music improve your focus? Does it make you focus more? I mean, Ben, not to put you on the spot, but like, what are your thoughts after having heard about some of the history of this music and having heard about some of the research that gets done into this sort of stuff?
Okay. So my initial response would be, I don't think we know. I think a pleasant work environment is probably going to create better workers. And I think the idea that you can isolate music specifically in that and then start to kind of really drill down into very, very, very specific things like genre, it sounds to me like we're on a little bit shaky ground. But yeah, like I'm sure, like, you know, like I said earlier in the episode, I've used music when I'm up against a deadline. You know, I can put on like music with a faster beat. I work better in certain environments than other environments, I think. You know, I don't like working around, you know, noisy places. I find that distracting. So there's aspects of it. And I think this is why sometimes effects research is difficult, because it's hard to kind of shake that fundamental truth that, you know, some people work better in some environments, and that there are things that we can learn from what those environments are. Yeah. But that's a very generalist, wishy-washy, unscientific claim. Whereas some of the more scientific claims that have been made in these papers, I am resistant to for obvious reasons.
I think that's totally fair, and that's pretty much where I'm at as well. I would say I'm a little bit more kind of benefit of the doubt in many cases in terms of the actual studies. I don't have many, like most of them, like I said, there are some with dubious methodologies. There are some where I just really don't like the sort of stimulus plus person equals effect kind of way of talking about human behavior. I just think that's really just simplistic and simplistic at best, wrong and egregious at worst. Yeah. But the fact is that there do seem to be lots of studies out there that show some effects. So I'm willing to say, actually, that it's a yes with caveats. Yeah. Like, yes, background music does, in some circumstances, seem to have some effects, some influences on certain people. Yeah. But the issue is the variability. Yeah. That we cannot talk about, you know, classical music does X, slow tempo music does Y. Yeah. Because it's going to depend so much on what the environment is, who the person is listening to it, all that sort of thing.
And I suppose one of the key points from the Muzak stuff is that the science, whether the science is true or not, is not actually the key point that's going on here. Muzak did have built, you know, an empire where they completely shaped the cultural landscapes of America for much of the latter half of the 20th century, using science to support their claims, which convinced, you know, maybe not cynical podcasters 100 years later, but convinced people at the time to spend money on it, and that's sort of, that did its job. So whether the science is true or not is perhaps not necessarily the most interesting question here.
It was. I think it's really hard to understate just how big Muzak was in the middle of the 20th century. One of the standout bits of info that I found in my research was that Muzak at one point was heard by more than 100 million people daily in 25 countries around the world. And out of the 150 largest corporations in America, by the late 70s, 150 largest corporations in America, only 7 of them did not use Muzak.
Wow.
So imagine how many people that is.
That's a
in
lot of brain
offices
worms.
And factories. Yeah. So it's absolutely huge. For 8 hours a day.
Yeah. No wonder people were sick of it by the 80s.
Exactly. You can see why the backlash happened, right? The other thing that I think is really problematic about the research in this, and while I'm willing to say that, yes, there do seem to be some effects, it's very varied. The other thing that I think is problematic is that you alluded to this before, Ben. there's the question of, well, what is the music? And if it does work, why does it work? Because that's the bit that they don't really. A lot of the research on this, they don't really seem to care about that.
No, why is always a missing point in
Yeah.
a lot of these sorts of studies, regardless of the episode. They're like, how does this work, and
Yeah.
why does it work in the way that it does?
When we increase the volume by 20%,
Yeah.
sales go up by 5% or something like that.
Yeah.
That they're not interested in why that might be.
Yeah.
Whether there is any logical connection between the volume of music and how much money they spend in a shop or something like that.
And is central to other scientific fields
Yeah.
as well, developing a theory about what is happening.
Absolutely. The final couple of points I wanted to make before we wrap up. Firstly, is the politics of this, which we talked about before. But this is really I get really uncomfortable reading a lot of the stuff around this about thinking about not just what does music potentially do to people, but thinking about, well, who gets to control that kind
Yeah.
of stuff? Whose interests is this music serving?
Yeah.
Because it's, even though there is, discourse around like worker well-being and workers being happier and more content and less bored, which, no one's going to complain about that. It's also thinking about, but why? Who is that good for, really?
Yeah.
It's like, workplace wellness kind of programs and things, which I know you're a huge fan of. But that sort of thing, it only really works to serve the interests of the managers, the business owners,
Yeah.
rather than the people who are listening and being subjected unwillingly in many cases to this kind of music.
There's potentially lots of ways to improve productivity and, giving workers a sense of ownership in the business that they take part in by, literally putting them on governing boards or other things. That might be another route where we might improve productivity.
Absolutely. I mean, and one of the things that kind of surprised me a little bit, though, was that how open Muzak, the company, was about those issues, about the politics of all this, really.
Yeah.
Like they'd literally talk about themselves as a management tool, an efficiency tool, and even a quote-unquote capitalist tool. They'd literally use those words. They'd say, improve your profits by using...
Those authors were right. They are capitalist pigs.
Yeah, exactly.
They said it. They admitted it.
But yeah, they're saying, you as a manager are engaged in a constant struggle to improve productivity or cut production costs or both, and we are the solution to that.
Yeah.
They live to serve businesses more so than the people who are actually listening to this stuff day in, day out.
Yeah.
The other thing that this brings us onto, and this is the final point I want to make, and why I was really keen to kind of dive into this topic really and do loads of research on it, was that this is actually a kind of a different sort of influence from the stuff that we've looked at before in other episodes. So we've debated quite a lot and, often debunked or at least poured some cold water over, questions about whether Child's Play 3 could be blamed for the death of, a toddler, or whether Barbie gives you eating disorders, all those kinds of things. But in those cases, we're talking about media that is consumed by choice.
Yeah.
In most cases.
Yeah.
People are choosing to play those games or play with that doll or watch that film or watch that TV show. For Muzak and a lot of background music, this is not an intended thing, right? They haven't made the choice to do that. And the outcomes we're talking about from things like Child's Play 3 or Barbie, that's an unintended outcome. Like, for example, a film normalizing a particular behavior that people don't like or is socially unacceptable. Whereas for Muzak, we're talking about intentional effects. Someone has designed this music and sold it to a particular kind of workplace because they want a very specific form of influence, form of effect.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a massive stretch to start using words like, I wouldn't use these words, but like words like mind control and brainwashing and manipulation and things. It's not a million miles away from that. If it does work in the way that they say it is.
There's serious ethical questions if you have the power that you claim to have about, where could this be used and in what ways could this be used? Particularly, like, it was silly at the time, but if there is a claim underneath this about, disaster victims or people going through intense trauma, that music can, potentially numb them to that. And even the relationship between the military and, the foundational, people involved in this, it quite quickly becomes not worrying necessarily, but it poses quite, intense ethical questions, I think.
Absolutely. And so what are you saying, Ben, that then your solution to, say, global conflict would not be to pipe music into those? Is that what you're saying?
Limp Bizkit.
Always Limp Bizkit. That's all for today. Thanks for listening to this episode. I've been Rich.
I'm Ben.
And if you like what we do, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please leave a review or recommend us to a friend. And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IllEffectsPod. We will be back in 2 weeks. But for now, we're going to fade into the background very gently. You've been listening to Ill Effects. This episode was researched by Richard McCulloch, produced by Rachel Wood, produced and edited by Caroline Pringle, edited and mixed by Colin Frank. The music for our episodes was created by Brutalust, which is Colin Frank and Maria Sappho, and recorded and mixed by Joe Crispin.